It was supposed to be a perfect evening, wine, candlelight, and a quiet restaurant tucked away in the city. Lisa had met Eric on a dating app a few weeks before, and after countless late-night conversations and flirty texts, they finally agreed to meet in person. He seemed charming, intelligent, and just mysterious enough to keep her intrigued. The date started smoothly. Eric was even more attractive in person, his dark eyes holding an intensity that made Lisa shiver, but in a good way. They talked about books, travel, and childhood memories. Every answer he gave was flawless, like he had rehearsed it, but Lisa brushed off the thought. Maybe he was just nervous. As dinner wrapped up, Eric suggested grabbing a drink at a bar nearby. The night was still young, and Lisa felt an electric pull toward him, so she agreed. The bar was dimly lit, filled with the low hum of conversation and jazz music. They found a booth in the back where Eric ordered them both a whiskey sour. Lisa took a sip and immediately felt a heavy warmth settle in her stomach. Minutes passed, then an hour. The world around her seemed to tilt. She wasn't drunk. She knew what being tipsy felt like, and this was something different. Her limbs felt sluggish, her eyelids heavy. Eric watched her closely, an odd little smile twitching at the corner of his lips. "You okay?" he asked, voice smooth and knowing. A red flag screamed in Lisa's mind, but she could barely react. I think I need to go home," she muttered, forcing herself to stand. Eric caught her arm, his grip firm. "I'll take you," he insisted. Somewhere deep in her fogged mind, panic flared. No, she couldn't let him. "No, I'll get a cab," she slurred. But her legs wobbled beneath her, and Eric was already leading her out the back door of the bar. The alley was dark, too dark. And suddenly, Lisa knew this wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a normal date gone wrong. She tried to yank her arm away, but Eric's grip was like steel. "Relax," he murmured, pushing her forward. Her vision blurred as the shadows stretched around them. Something was waiting for her in that darkness. Something she wasn't meant to escape. Just as her body sagged, barely able to hold itself up, she heard another voice, a sharp, angry voice cutting through the haze. "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" Footsteps pounded toward them. A man, maybe a bar employee, maybe just a good Samaritan, came rushing forward. Eric let go instantly, raising his hands like he hadn't just been dragging Lisa into the unknown. "She's drunk," he said, all innocence and concern. "I was just helping her." Lisa collapsed against the cold brick wall, gasping for air. The stranger didn't buy it. "Then why were you taking her this way?" he demanded. Eric hesitated, just a flicker of hesitation. Then he turned, slipping into the darkness before anyone could stop him. The Good Samaritan helped Lisa call a cab and waited with her until she could think clearly again. When she tried to find Eric's dating profile later, it was gone, vanished without a trace. She went to the police, but they told her there wasn't much they could do. No crime had technically been committed, but Lisa knew. She knew that if that stranger hadn't intervened, she wouldn't be here to tell her story.
Story number 2.
It was a quiet Friday night when Sarah decided to meet up with Brian, a guy she'd met through mutual friends. The night was set for a casual dinner at a new trendy restaurant downtown. Nothing extravagant, just a chance to get to know each other a little better. She was feeling optimistic. Brian had always been polite in their conversations, and his photos were charming. The restaurant was bustling with energy, but Brian seemed completely relaxed, his dark, almost unnervingly intense eyes never leaving Sarah's face as they talked. As the night wore on, Sarah started to notice small, strange things. Brian didn't drink much, just sipped his water slowly, never letting his gaze slip. Sarah felt a creeping discomfort, but she brushed it off. Maybe he was just shy, or maybe the intensity was part of his personality. After dinner, he suggested a walk in the nearby park. "It's a beautiful night," he said, his voice so smooth it almost didn't sound real. Sarah agreed, hoping the fresh air might ease the odd tension that had been building. They walked through the park, the distant city lights casting eerie shadows across the quiet pathways. The air was cool, and Sarah was beginning to feel a little better, but something kept gnawing at her. "I really like how you laugh," Brian said suddenly, his voice low. "It's very genuine." She smiled awkwardly. "Thanks," but it felt too intimate, too strange. She didn't know how to respond to that. Before she could say anything else, Brian stopped walking. He turned to face her, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "I've been wanting to do something," he said, his tone odd. Sarah didn't understand what he meant, but suddenly it didn't matter. She felt the sharp, gut-wrenching instinct that something was wrong. Every hair on the back of her neck stood up as she looked around. The park was completely empty, no one in sight. The city seemed far away, muffled, like they were in a different world altogether. And then it hit her. Brian had been too perfect, too in control, too calm. "I think I need to go," she said, her voice shaky. Brian's smile faltered just a fraction of a second, but it was enough for Sarah to notice. He knew she was catching on. Before she could step back, he reached for her arm, his fingers cold and unyielding. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his grip tightening. Panic shot through her chest. She tried to pull away, but he was too strong, his hand like a vice. The air seemed to freeze around them, the park suddenly more suffocating than open. "Let go of me," she screamed. Brian didn't flinch. His smile returned, but it was darker now, twisted. "You're mine now," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. In that moment, Sarah saw it, the change in his eyes. The calm facade had cracked, revealing something far more sinister beneath. Her heart pounded, and her entire body screamed at her to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Just as she thought she was going to pass out from sheer terror, there was a sudden shout. "Hey, what the hell is going on?" A jogger, a man in his late 30s, came running up the path, shouting for help. He stopped short when he saw the situation. Sarah trying to escape, Brian gripping her arm. Without a word, the jogger charged toward them, shoving Brian away with enough force to send him stumbling backward. Sarah broke free instantly, her adrenaline kicking in. She didn't hesitate. She ran. The jogger stayed behind, calling the police as Sarah sprinted through the park, never once looking back. When the police arrived, they searched the area, but Brian was gone, vanished as though he'd never been there. The next day, Sarah found something chilling in her phone's photo gallery. A picture of her asleep, taken from above, right before the dinner started. She never saw Brian again, but she never forgot that look in his eyes, the one that said he wasn't just a man trying to charm her. He was a predator, and she had almost become his prey.
Story number 3.
It started out as a simple blind date. Jessica had been talking to Mark for a couple of weeks online, and everything seemed perfect. He was kind, funny, and he shared all her interests. They decided to meet at a small, cozy cafe in the heart of the city. She was excited, even a little nervous, but she had no reason to be afraid. When Jessica walked into the cafe, she immediately spotted him. Mark was sitting at a corner table, his back straight, his posture impeccable. He was exactly how he appeared in his photos. Dark hair, sharp jawline, and an intense, almost too intense smile. He stood as she approached, greeting her with a warm hug. His hands were cold, too cold for someone who had been inside the cafe for a while, but she didn't think much of it. Maybe he was just naturally cold-blooded. They talked for hours, discussing everything from their childhoods to their favorite movies. But as the night went on, Jessica began to notice small oddities. Mark's laughter was too sharp, his eye contact too unblinking. He kept glancing at his phone every few minutes, but when Jessica asked what he was looking at, he just smiled and said, "Nothing important." As the evening wore on, Jessica started to feel a subtle unease creeping over her. The cafe, which had been bustling when they first arrived, was now nearly empty. The waiter had disappeared, and the lights in the cafe seemed dimmer. Jessica glanced at her watch. It was already 10:45 p.m., far later than she had intended to stay. "I should head out soon," she said, trying to mask the unease in her voice. Mark didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared at her for a moment, the smile on his face not reaching his eyes. "I don't think you should go just yet," he finally said, his voice low and almost possessive. The hairs on the back of Jessica's neck stood up. Something was wrong. "I'm fine." "Really? I should get going," she said, standing up. Mark's face shifted. For a moment, it looked like he was smiling, but there was something off about it. The smile didn't reach his eyes. In fact, his eyes had gone cold, flat. "You don't really want to leave," he said, standing and stepping closer. Jessica backed away, her heart racing. "No, I really do. Before she could finish her sentence, Mark's phone vibrated in his pocket. His eyes flickered to it, and for a moment, she saw something strange in his expression, like a flicker of recognition, but not in a good way. He pulled his phone out and stared at it, his face falling into an unreadable mask. Jessica seized the opportunity and bolted for the door. She was almost outside when she heard Mark's voice behind her. "Don't go," he called, too calmly for someone who had just been talking to her like they were on a casual date. But Jessica didn't stop. She dashed into the street, her legs moving faster than they had ever moved before. She hailed a taxi, telling the driver to take her to the nearest safe place, her friend's apartment, a hotel, anywhere but where she had just been. The next day, she received a message from Mark, and her blood ran cold when she saw the picture attached. It was a photo of her asleep on the table in the cafe, her head resting on her arms, completely unaware. The timestamp on the photo was from 20 minutes ago. It wasn't a selfie. Someone had taken the picture from across the room. Jessica had no memory of falling asleep. The message simply read, "You didn't think I'd let you leave, did you?" After that, Jessica never heard from Mark again, but the fear never left her. What haunted her the most wasn't the photo, it was the look in his eyes when he had told her she didn't want to leave. She knew then, deep down, he wasn't just a man who wanted her company. He wanted something far darker. She never went back to that cafe, and she never went on a blind date again.
Story number 4.
Samantha had always been a skeptic. She didn't believe in ghosts, monsters, or anything supernatural. So, when her friends invited her on a ghost tour in an old, supposedly haunted mansion at the edge of town, she wasn't scared in the slightest. They'd had a few drinks and were looking for something fun to do on a Saturday night, and this seemed like the perfect way to prove to everyone that there was no such thing as ghosts. The mansion was decrepit, a crumbling structure with ivy crawling up the sides. It was the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but Samantha wasn't fazed. The group entered the mansion, and the tour guide, an older man with a raspy voice, led them through the dark halls, telling stories of tragic deaths and paranormal occurrences. Samantha rolled her eyes as her friends shuddered at every creak of the floorboards and every gust of wind. As they reached the second floor, the guide stopped in front of a large, ornate mirror. This mirror, he said, was once owned by a woman named Eleanor. She was a young bride who tragically died here, and it said that her spirit still lingers, trapped inside the glass. Samantha smirked. Sounds like a typical ghost story. Nothing to worry about. But as she said that, something strange happened. The air grew colder. Not just a little cooler. It felt like a sudden drop in temperature, like stepping into a freezer. Her breath formed visible clouds in front of her face. Everyone else was too caught up in the story to notice, but Samantha's skin tingled. Her heart began to race. She turned to her friend Claire. "Did you feel that?" Claire looked at her, wide-eyed. "What's going on?" Before Samantha could answer, she saw it. A faint movement in the mirror. At first, she thought it was just the reflection of someone moving behind her, but when she looked around, there was no one. The glass shifted slightly, and for a brief second, she could have sworn she saw a figure, a woman in white, her face pale and contorted in grief, her hand pressed against the glass as if trying to break free. Samantha froze, her blood running cold. "Did anyone else see that?" she whispered, but no one responded. They were still focused on the tour guide's stories. She blinked, and when she looked back at the mirror, the woman was gone. "Okay, that was weird," she muttered, trying to brush it off as a trick of the light. She told herself that she was just imagining things, but the eerie sensation of being watched never left her. The group continued on, making their way to the attic, the floorboards creaking under their feet. As they climbed the narrow, spiraling staircase, the sense of unease grew stronger. The cold had followed them, and it was suffocating now. When they reached the attic, the guide gestured to an old, dust-covered chest in the corner. "This is where Eleanor was found," he said. "She died here, and it said that her spirit will never leave the mansion. It's especially active in the attic." Samantha laughed nervously. "Come on, guys. We're just here for a tour. This place is probably just drafty and old." But as soon as she finished speaking, the door to the attic slammed shut with a deafening bang. The group jumped back in shock. "Did you do that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Samantha shook her head, trying to calm everyone down. "It's just the wind. Don't freak out." But then the air grew even colder, and a faint whisper echoed through the attic. So soft, so faint, it was barely audible. Samantha felt her stomach tighten. She couldn't make out the words, but she felt the chill of a presence, something watching them, something angry. Suddenly, the room darkened, the light bulb flickering above them, casting shadows across the walls. The group huddled together, but before they could move, the door slammed open again, hard enough to knock the hinges loose. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. The figure from the mirror, the woman in white, was standing in the doorway, her face twisted in sorrow and rage. Her hand was outstretched toward them, as if trying to reach through the darkness to grab hold of them. The air around them felt suffocating. The temperature had dropped so low that Samantha could see her breath clouding in front of her. Her legs were frozen, rooted to the spot in pure terror. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, and the lights flickered back on, casting the attic back into its normal dusty gloom. The group stood there, speechless, for what felt like an eternity. No one said anything. No one even moved. When they finally left the mansion, the night air felt warm, almost comforting, compared to the freezing cold they had just endured. But as Samantha got into her car, she looked into the rearview mirror, and her blood ran cold. There, standing just behind her, was the reflection of the woman in white, her hand pressed against the glass. Samantha slammed her foot on the accelerator, her heart racing as she drove away from the mansion. But she could still feel the presence lingering, like something was following her, something that wouldn't let go.
Story number 5.
Lena had always loved the thrill of the unknown. That's what led her to sign up for a late-night walk through the old cemetery on the outskirts of town, one of the oldest in the area. It was known for its eerie, weathered tombstones and strange stories that the locals whispered about. People claimed it was haunted, some said by the spirits of those buried there, others by something far darker. But Lena wasn't a believer in ghosts or spirits. That night, she arrived alone. The other participants had canceled at the last minute, leaving her as the only one to brave the walk through the cemetery. The tour guide, an older man with a gravelly voice, smiled at her as she arrived, as though he were expecting her. "You're the only one tonight," he said, his eyes gleaming in the dim light of the lantern he held. Lena chuckled. "Guess I'm in for a private tour." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yes, well, I hope you're not afraid of the dark." They set off into the cemetery, the guide talking about the history of the place, pointing out ancient graves, and telling stories of mysterious disappearances. As they walked deeper into the cemetery, the air grew colder. Lena shivered, but again she shrugged it off as nothing more than the chill of the night air. When they reached the farthest corner of the cemetery, the guide stopped. "This is the oldest part of the cemetery," he said, his voice suddenly softer. "It's where the most unusual things have happened." Lena glanced around. The tombstones here were cracked and weathered, some leaning at odd angles. The whole area had a sense of decay, like it had been forgotten by time. "Why unusual?" she asked, half amused. The guide didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be staring at something just beyond her, his expression tightening. Finally, he spoke. "Some people say that the spirits here don't rest. They're restless. They've been known to reach out to those who enter." Lena laughed lightly. "You don't really believe that, do you?" The guy didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned and walked a few paces forward. But just as Lena was about to catch up, she heard a faint sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. She froze. "Did you hear that?" The guy didn't respond. He was already a few steps ahead, but when Lena glanced at him, she saw something strange. The lantern in his hand was shaking slightly, the light flickering in an unsettling way. A sudden gust of wind blew through the cemetery, rustling the leaves on the ground, but the whispering continued. This time it was louder, more distinct. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound was undeniable. "Hello?" Lena called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. Just as she turned to head back to the main path, the lantern in the guide's hand flickered again, and this time it went out completely. The cemetery was plunged into complete darkness. Lena gasped, her heart pounding. "What's going on?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice. There was a long pause, and then the guide's voice came from the darkness. "You shouldn't have come here." Lena's blood ran cold. His voice was wrong, too low, too hollow, like it wasn't quite him. She tried to back away, but something seemed to pull her toward him. Her body felt heavy, as though the air itself was pressing against her, suffocating her. Suddenly, the lantern flared to life again, but it wasn't the guide holding it. It was someone else, someone standing right behind him. Lena froze. The figure was tall, pale, and wearing tattered clothing. Its face was obscured by shadows, but the hollow black eyes staring at her through the darkness made her heart stop. The figure's mouth opened, and the whispering began again, louder this time, as though the figure was speaking directly into her mind. In a blur of fear, Lena bolted, running as fast as she could. But no matter how fast she ran, the air felt thick, heavy, as though something was chasing her. The whispering followed her, growing louder with each step, urging her to stop, to look back. When she reached the gate of the cemetery, she flung it open, but just as she stepped onto the road outside, the whispering stopped. Everything went silent. She spun around, expecting to see the figure still looming in the cemetery, but there was nothing. The cemetery was empty. The night was still. Lena didn't stop running until she reached her car. She locked the doors and sat in the driver's seat, hands trembling. But when she glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw something that made her stomach drop. The figure from the cemetery, standing right behind her, staring through the glass with those empty, hollow eyes. In that moment, Lena realized the worst truth. Whatever had followed her out of the cemetery was no longer a spirit. It was something that had attached itself to her, something that wouldn't let her go. She never went back to that cemetery, but the whispers never stopped.
Story number 6.
It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. Jack, Sarah, and their friend Ben had decided to spend the weekend in the woods, far from the bustling city. They'd packed their gear, set up tents, and started a fire to roast marshmallows, just like they had done 100 times before. The air was fresh, the sky was clear, and the sounds of the forest were peaceful until it wasn't. As night fell, the forest seemed to change. The shadows grew longer, and the sounds of the animals seemed to die down. The usual rustling of leaves and chirping of crickets was replaced by a strange, unsettling silence. Sarah could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, but she dismissed it as the chill of the night air. Ben, the more adventurous of the group, suggested they take a walk to explore deeper into the woods. "It'll be fun. Just a short walk to stretch our legs," he said, flashing a grin. Jack was hesitant, but Sarah agreed, thinking the walk might help shake off the unease creeping into her mind. The three of them set off, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The trees towered above them, their branches creaking in the wind. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the air seemed to grow colder, and the path started to narrow, forcing them to walk closer together. That's when they heard it, a low, guttural sound. It wasn't an animal, at least not any animal they had ever heard. It was a deep, throaty growl, followed by a scratching noise that made Sarah's stomach tighten. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Ben chuckled nervously. "It's probably a bear or something, nothing to worry about." But Jack wasn't so sure. "No, that wasn't a bear. It sounded like something else." The growl came again, louder this time, followed by a sudden thud, like something large had fallen to the ground. Sarah's heart began to race. "We need to go back to camp, now." But before they could turn around, they heard footsteps behind them. Slow, deliberate footsteps, heavy like someone or something was following them. Ben turned, flashing his light into the darkness, but the beam only illuminated trees and shadows. "It's probably just some other campers," he said, though his voice now held a hint of uncertainty. Then they heard it again. A voice, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the trees. It sounded like a whisper, but it was too deep, too distorted. It seemed to be calling their names, one by one, as if it knew who they were. Jack, Sarah, Ben. They froze, terror gripping them as the voice echoed through the trees, repeating their names over and over, growing louder with each repetition. There was something wrong about it. It didn't sound like a human. It was too wrong, too distorted, like something mimicking them, pretending to be someone they knew. Suddenly, Ben turned and started to run. "I'm out of here!" he shouted, panic in his voice. Jack and Sarah didn't hesitate. They followed Ben, adrenaline flooding their bodies as they sprinted through the woods, their flashlights flickering and casting frantic beams of light across the trees. But the voice was still there, still calling their names. It seemed to be all around them, coming from every direction. The footsteps behind them were getting closer, faster, like something was right on their heels. The fear surged in Sarah's chest, making her legs feel like lead. They ran for what felt like hours until they stumbled into a clearing. And there, in the center of the clearing, was an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, its wooden walls sagging and the windows boarded up. "We need to get inside," Jack gasped, pulling at Sarah's arm. They ran toward the cabin, but just as they reached the door, they heard it again. The voice, this time clear and close, right behind them. "I see you." In a blur of fear, they yanked open the door and rushed inside. The cabin was pitch black, save for the faint glow of the flashlights. They locked the door behind them and huddled in the corner, trying to catch their breath. The voice outside was still there, still calling their names, but it was getting fainter, almost as if it was losing interest. For a while, there was only silence. They stayed in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest, half expecting something to crash through the door at any moment. But after what felt like an eternity, the sound of footsteps faded, and the whispers stopped. "We need to get out of here," Sarah whispered, barely audible. But Jack and Ben didn't respond. They were both sitting against the wall, staring blankly at the floor. When Sarah turned to look at them, she froze. Their eyes were wide open, staring at her, but they weren't seeing her. Their faces were pale, their expressions slack. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. And then she heard it again. A whisper, so close it felt like it was inside her head. "You're not alone." She turned, her flashlight shaking in her hand, and saw it. A shadow in the corner of the cabin, moving with a life of its own. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shifting like smoke, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. The figure slowly extended a long, twisted hand toward her, and for the first time, Sarah understood what it had all been. The voices, the footsteps, the whispers, it had been leading them here. But now, it wasn't interested in Jack or Ben. It was interested in her. She screamed, but the shadow's hand was already reaching for her throat. And as her vision blurred, she realized too late. The forest didn't want them to leave.
Story number 7.
Katie had always been a night owl. She loved the quiet of the late hours when everyone else was asleep, the world outside her window was still, and she could enjoy her own company. That night, after a long day of work, she decided to take a walk in the neighborhood to clear her head. It was a typical suburban area, safe and familiar, nothing that would ever make her worry. As she walked down the dimly lit street, a soft mist began to settle around her, the kind of fog that seemed to creep up without warning. She pulled her coat tighter around her, the chill sinking into her bones. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something was about to happen. Though she couldn't put her finger on it, Katie continued her walk, turning onto a side street that led to the woods at the edge of town. This was a road she'd walked down many times before, but tonight something felt off. The usual sounds of the neighborhood, distant dogs barking, cars driving by, were absent. It was eerily quiet. No one was outside. Not even a single streetlight flickered. She picked up the pace, but the deeper she got into the street, the more disorienting the mist became. It was hard to see anything beyond a few feet in front of her. She felt as though she was being swallowed by the fog. Out of nowhere, Katie heard footsteps behind her. Light, hesitant, but they were getting closer. She stopped and turned, expecting to see someone else walking in the fog. Maybe another late-night wanderer, but there was no one. The street was empty, the mist thickening as if to hide everything from view. The footsteps stopped. Katie stood frozen, her breath quickening. She was alone. She had to be. But then, just as she began to take another step, a voice broke through the silence, barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have come this way." Katie spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. No one was there. She was about to call out, thinking she had heard someone hidden in the mist, but then she saw something that made her stomach drop. A shadow, just a shape, moving in the fog. It wasn't a person, it was something wrong. The figure was tall, too tall for any human, and it moved in unnatural jerks, like it was struggling to keep its balance. The shadow flickered in and out of existence, appearing and disappearing between the fog, always moving closer. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her legs were frozen, as if the mist itself had wrapped around her and bound her in place. The shadow took a step forward, then another. Katie's breathing became shallow as she took a step back. "You're lost, aren't you?" The voice whispered again, now right behind her. A cold hand brushed her shoulder. Katie spun around in terror, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive fog. She began to run, heart pounding, her footsteps echoing in the silence as she rushed back down the street toward the safety of the lights. But every time she looked behind her, she saw the shadow, closer now, just at the edge of her vision. It was following her. Desperate, she ran faster, her legs burning as she pushed herself harder. The fog seemed to close in, making it harder and harder to see, like the world was closing in on her. The further she ran, the more the shadows around her twisted and warped, taking on shapes, faces, figures, things she couldn't quite understand. Finally, she reached the end of the street, her neighborhood lights in sight. She burst into the open area, gasping for air, but as she slowed to a stop, she felt the weight of eyes on her. She turned, breathing heavily, expecting to see the shadow standing behind her. But when she looked back, there was nothing. The fog had begun to lift, and the street was empty. Relieved, Katie let out a shaky breath. It was over. She had escaped whatever it was that had been following her, or so she thought. Just as she began to head back home, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a text message, one she didn't recognize. "You can't escape." Katie's heart dropped. She looked around, panic seizing her chest, but no one was there. As she backed away from the street, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched, she heard the voice again, this time coming from the shadows just behind her. "I told you, you shouldn't have come this way." Katie turned and ran home faster than she ever had before, but the feeling that something was still watching her never left. For the rest of that week, the texts kept coming, always the same. "You can't escape." It wasn't until much later that she learned the street she had walked down was part of an old path that had been forgotten by the town's residents. A path that, decades ago, had been the site of several unexplained disappearances. The town had stopped using it when they started hearing strange whispers in the fog. No one had dared walk it since. And now Katie realized the thing that had followed her wasn't a shadow, it was something from the past, something that had been waiting for someone to walk that path again. And it wasn't about to let her forget.
Story number 8.
Maggie had never been one for urban legends. She was a practical woman, always relying on logic and reason to get through life. So when her friend Rachel invited her to spend the weekend at a cabin in the woods, Maggie wasn't concerned about the location, despite its history. The cabin was located deep in the forest, miles away from any other homes or towns. But Rachel assured her it would be an adventure, a way to disconnect from the world and unwind. The first night passed without incident. They drank wine, talked, and relaxed by the fireplace. The only sounds outside were the wind rustling the trees and the occasional animal in the distance. Maggie thought the woods felt peaceful, almost serene, but there was something about the place that gnawed at the back of her mind, something that unsettled her. On the second night, as they sat on the porch drinking their second bottle of wine, Rachel told Maggie about the legend of the cabin. "This place used to belong to a family," she said, staring into the dark woods. "They disappeared without a trace years ago, right after moving in. Some say they were taken by something in the woods." Maggie scoffed. "Come on, Rachel. You don't really believe that, do you?" Rachel hesitated, her face becoming serious. "I don't know. It's just that, well, some people say they still hear things out here. Voices, footsteps. People say the family never really left." Maggie rolled her eyes, trying to dismiss the creeping sense of unease that had begun to form. "It's probably just local folklore. You know how these stories go." Rachel shrugged, but Maggie noticed that her friend's gaze kept shifting toward the dark woods, like she was expecting something to step out of the shadows at any moment. That night, Maggie had trouble sleeping. The wind howled outside, and the creaking of the old cabin kept her awake. Every now and then she thought she heard something moving in the trees, but when she got up to check, there was nothing there. By the third night, Maggie could no longer ignore the strange feeling in the pit of her stomach. The air had become thick, oppressive, and it felt as if the forest was alive, watching. Rachel had fallen asleep, leaving Maggie alone in the quiet of the cabin. Around midnight, Maggie was jolted awake by a loud bang from downstairs. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat up in bed, listening. Another bang, followed by a soft scraping sound. Something was downstairs. She cautiously got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from her bag. Her hands were shaking as she descended the stairs, the beam of light flickering as she moved. The silence was suffocating, the house holding its breath as she tiptoed down the hall toward the living room. The front door was wide open. Maggie's blood ran cold. She had locked it before they went to bed. She remembered doing it, the click of the lock echoing in her mind. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, and the door slammed shut on its own as Maggie stepped inside the living room. But what froze her in place wasn't the wind, it was what she saw next. In the middle of the room, illuminated by the faint moonlight shining through the windows, a figure stood facing her. It was tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow, but Maggie could feel its eyes boring into her, cold and predatory. The air around it was thick, suffocating, as if the room itself was alive with the presence of something that shouldn't be there. Before she could react, the figure whispered, barely audible, "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was wrong, too deep, too distorted. It was like the voice of the woods itself, ancient and unforgiving. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, stumbling over the rug. She could hear something else now, a faint whisper, a scratching noise coming from the walls around her. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, shifting like something was trying to break through the walls. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut again, trapping her in the living room. The figure took a step forward, its tall, impossibly long arms reaching out toward her. Then a voice from behind her, Rachel's voice, weak and trembling. "Maggie!" Maggie spun around, but there was no one there. Rachel wasn't anywhere in the room. A low growl rumbled from the darkness, and Maggie's blood ran cold. She turned back toward the figure. It was now inches from her, its form flickering and distorting like it was made of smoke and shadows. Its eyes glowed faintly, an unnatural yellow that burned through the darkness. It was no longer just standing, it was moving toward her, its long fingers reaching for her throat. Maggie screamed, and with all the strength she had, she pushed herself toward the door, managing to pry it open just enough to slip through. She bolted into the woods, heart racing, the figure's growls echoing behind her. She didn't stop running until she was back at her car, trembling, gasping for breath. She glanced back toward the cabin. The mist that had descended on the woods seemed thicker now, swallowing the house whole. But for a moment, she thought she saw something standing in the window of the cabin. The figure, watching her. Maggie never spoke to Rachel again after that night. And when she went to tell the police what had happened, they found no trace of the cabin. It wasn't even on the map. No one knew what she was talking about. It was like it had never existed. But Maggie knew better. She knew that whatever had been in those woods, whatever had whispered to her, was still out there waiting for its next victim.
Story number 9.
The old mansion had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Its windows were boarded up, its once grand doors rotting away, and the yard was overgrown with weeds that seemed to have grown wild for decades. It was a place that had terrified the local kids, a place where whispers about its dark past echoed through the small town. No one dared to go near it, except for Danny. Danny had always been drawn to the mysterious. While the other kids feared the mansion, he found himself intrigued by it, especially after hearing the story of Sarah Hawthorne, the mansion's last known resident. According to the townspeople, Sarah was a young woman who had gone mad after the loss of her husband. It was said that on the night of his funeral, she locked herself inside the house and was never seen again. Some said she died there. Others claimed she had become a ghost, trapped in the house forever, but no one knew for sure. Danny, never one to shy away from a challenge, decided one evening that he would explore the mansion himself. He didn't believe in ghosts. He thought it was all just superstition, something to scare children. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight, he pushed open the rusted gate and made his way up the cracked stone path to the front door. The air was thick with the scent of decay as he stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath his feet, and the beam from his flashlight flickered as though it too was uncertain about what was lurking in the darkness. Dust filled the air, and the silence was so complete it felt oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Danny crept through the grand hallway, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and unease. As he walked deeper into the house, the temperature seemed to drop. The walls were lined with old portraits, their eyes seemingly following him as he passed. But it was the deeper parts of the house that drew him in, the rooms that were locked, the places that had been sealed off for years. He found a narrow staircase leading to the attic, and despite every instinct telling him to turn back, he ascended the stairs. The attic door creaked open, revealing a space that felt suffocating. The air inside was thick with dust, the floor covered in old rotting furniture and forgotten belongings. But in the center of the room, a large ornate mirror stood against the wall, its frame carved with intricate patterns that seemed almost too detailed to be real. Danny approached it cautiously, his reflection staring back at him through the glass. But there was something wrong. He could see himself, of course, but there was a shadow, a figure standing just behind him, barely visible at first, but growing clearer as he turned to look. His heart skipped a beat. No one was there. When he turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. But the reflection of the room had changed. The dusty furniture had vanished, replaced by what looked like a well-maintained room, Sarah's room. The walls were decorated with lace curtains, a large four-poster bed covered with a white duvet, and the faint sound of a woman humming filled the room. "Sarah?" Danny whispered, his voice trembling. He felt a chill run down his spine. The humming stopped abruptly, and a soft voice, a woman's voice, spoke from behind him. "Why are you here?" Danny spun around. There was no one behind him, but the air felt thick with someone else. He looked back into the mirror. The room was still there, but now there was someone sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at him with hollow, empty eyes. Her hair was long and dark, her skin pale as marble. She smiled, but the smile was wrong, like something twisted and unnatural. "Leave," she whispered, her voice echoing in the room. "You don't belong here." Danny tried to move, but his feet were glued to the floor, his body paralyzed with fear. He couldn't look away from the mirror. The woman in the reflection stood and slowly approached the glass, her hand outstretched as if she wanted to touch him. Suddenly, he felt a cold, clammy hand on his shoulder. His heart nearly stopped. He didn't dare turn around. But the voice came again, louder this time, closer. "You shouldn't have come." The hand on his shoulder tightened, and Danny finally managed to break free, stumbling back away from the mirror. He ran down the stairs, his breath ragged, the feeling of being watched overwhelming him. The house seemed to shift as he ran through it, hallways stretching, doors closing in on him. When he finally reached the front door, he yanked it open with all his strength, the old hinges protesting. He ran out into the night, the cold air rushing to meet him. But when he looked back at the mansion, the lights inside flickered on, casting eerie shadows against the cracked windows. And in the upper window, the silhouette of the woman stood, watching him. He never spoke about that night again. Some say that Sarah's spirit had been trapped in the mirror, a reflection of her sorrow, of her madness, and that anyone who looked into it would see more than just themselves. They would see the dark side of the house, the real house, the one that had never been abandoned at all. Danny never went near the mansion again. But sometimes, when he walked past it, he could swear he saw something watching from behind the windows, something that wasn't quite human. And he knew deep down that Sarah was still there, waiting for someone else to make the mistake of stepping inside.
Story number 10.
Lena had always been drawn to the forgotten places. Old, abandoned buildings, decaying mansions, and overgrown graveyards. She loved exploring them, capturing photos and learning their histories. When she heard about the old asylum at the edge of town, she was intrigued. It had been closed for decades, left to rot in the woods, and everyone knew the rumors that it was haunted, that the spirits of the patients still wandered the halls, unable to find peace. But Lena wasn't scared of ghosts. She believed in history, not the supernatural. So she decided to visit the asylum one night, hoping to get some good shots for her blog. She packed her camera, grabbed a flashlight, and headed out to the outskirts of town. The drive was long, the road twisting and turning through the dense forest, and soon the trees grew so thick that the moonlight barely reached the ground. The asylum loomed ahead, its dark silhouette cutting against the sky. Its walls were cracked and covered in moss, the windows boarded up long ago. The air was thick with the scent of decay. Lena stepped out of her car, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots, the only sound breaking the silence. She walked toward the entrance, the large iron gates hanging open, almost as if inviting her in. The building was eerily still, and yet something about it felt alive. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, the creak of the hinges sending a shiver down her spine. The air inside was musty, damp, filled with the smell of mildew and rot. She flicked on her flashlight, casting long shadows against the walls as she ventured deeper into the asylum. The walls were lined with peeling paint, and old, rusted medical equipment was scattered around the floors. The silence was thick, oppressive, and as she moved through the halls, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Her footsteps echoed in the dark, and as she rounded a corner, she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. A long hallway, lined with closed doors. But one of the doors was slightly ajar, just enough to show a sliver of darkness beyond. Lena's curiosity got the better of her. She walked toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she pushed it open, the air grew colder, the atmosphere heavier. She aimed her flashlight into the room, revealing a scene frozen in time. The room was empty, save for a single bed in the center, its sheets yellowed with age. On the walls, old papers and charts hung, faded and torn. But what caught Lena's eye was a mirror on the far side of the room, cracked in several places, but still intact. She walked toward it, her breath catching in her throat. There was something wrong about the reflection. At first, it looked like her own face staring back at her, but the longer she looked, the more distorted her reflection became. Her features began to blur, her skin growing pale, her eyes sinking into shadow. Lena took a step back, but as she did, the reflection didn't move. It stayed, staring at her with those dark, hollow eyes, almost like it was waiting. A chill crawled up her spine. "This isn't right," she whispered to herself, but before she could turn to leave, a voice, soft and raspy, drifted from behind her. "You shouldn't be here." Lena's blood ran cold. She whipped around, but no one was there. The room was empty. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed toward the door, but the moment she turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. She spun around in panic. The mirror now reflected someone else standing behind her. A figure, hunched and cloaked in shadow, stood just out of the reach of her flashlight's beam. Its face was obscured by dark, tangled hair, but Lena could feel its presence. It was watching her. The voice spoke again, this time louder, more forceful. "Leave, now." Lena's hand shook as she reached for the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure in the mirror stepped closer, its shape becoming clearer, its long, bony fingers pressing against the glass. She turned back to the room in desperation, but there was something different now. The room was no longer empty. There were dozens of figures, pale, gaunt, and standing motionless around her. They were patients, their eyes vacant and hollow, their faces twisted in agony. The room seemed to close in around her as the figures began to move, their limbs jerking unnaturally. Panic surged through Lena as she fought against the door, her mind racing. She could hear whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs, growing louder, until they were all around her. The figures moved closer, their hands reaching out, their mouths opening in silent screams. Finally, with one last desperate push, Lena broke through the door and stumbled into the hallway. She could hear the figures following her, their feet scraping against the floor, their breath hot on her neck. She ran, her flashlight flickering as she made her way back through the asylum, the walls closing in, the whispers growing louder. But as she reached the front doors, they wouldn't open. She slammed into them, her shoulder aching, but the doors were locked tight, as if the building itself had decided she wasn't allowed to leave. The whispers rose to a crescendo, and as Lena turned in a panic, the figures were there, surrounding her. She could feel their cold hands brushing against her skin, their eyes boring into her soul. And then, as if all the air in the room had been sucked out at once, everything went dark. The next morning, Lena's car was found abandoned in front of the asylum, the doors wide open. The flashlight lay on the ground, its light flickering in the breeze. But Lena was never found. Some say they still hear her voice in the asylum, faint and distant, calling out to anyone who might hear. Others say they see her reflection in the cracked mirror, her eyes wide with terror, trapped in the asylum forever, just like the others who came before her.